The reason we're here today, this is the science section, but I'm afraid we've sort of hijacked the science section slightly, because one thing that I'm very interested in, and as we were doing all the years of QI, we kept discovering that everyone, no matter how important they were in terms of taking forward their area of expertise of science or any other category, they all seem to harbor just a little bit of batshit in them that kind of meant that it makes you wonder, if that wasn't there, could they have done what they did? And I became obsessed with this. I became obsessed with people who were trying to prove their own theories around the world. So we, as I say, we come from a world of interesting facts. And I love facts like the ones that they just sound so ridiculous. Like, did you know this? In 1895, the only two cars in Ohio crashed into each other. How? And what was the conversation afterwards? What would they say to each other? That's the kind of stuff that we love. What's the fact?
There's one that I found the other day about how British nuclear submarines can go for 30 years without surfacing because they have an infinite energy supply and all of these supplies that let them stay down there for years. The thing they have to come back up for is sausages. Like, that's the first thing they run out of.
Yes. Apparently they love sausages on nuclear submarines, and so they have to come back restock. But technically, 30 years is the time they can do. So we collect all that kind of stuff. And I'll tell you, the moment that changed my life was when I met what I believed was an impossible human, telling me stories that I thought, this can't be true, but everyone believed it. It's someone you probably all know, Brian Blessed, right? So Brian Blessed once told me, and I watched an entire room just accept it as fact, that once while he was scaling Mount Everest, which he has done, he and his team survived an oncoming avalanche that should have killed them all. He survived it by, he says, yelling it into another direction. And the entire room was like, oh, yeah, that definitely happened. So I took him aside and I said, that's really interesting. What were you doing there? He said, we were doing Mallory's expedition, but actually I was looking for the Yeti. And I was like, wow, tell me more. And he said, well, here's an interesting fact about the Yeti. You love facts. I'll give you a fact. It is easier to escape a female Yeti than it is a male Yeti, because female Yetis have such long dangling boobs that before they can chase you, they need to throw them over their shoulder, tie them up like a scarf, or they might trip on them. In the time they do that, you can run away. Now, that was presented as a fact to me, okay? And I have since subsequently met a lot of people who believe in Yetis, and I've asked them, have you heard this thing? I heard this really funny thing. And they're like, yep, that's true. And so I realized there is a world of facts out there that people are believing in. And so I wrote these two books. Alex, do you want to take over
sure.
here?
So the first one, I was around the whole time you were writing this. It was quite an experience to behold. The Theory of Everything Else. Yeah. And then the kids version, Impossible Things, as well. Yeah,
because I thought kids should know all this crazy shit too. Here's what did it. Alex, can you hold up the cover a sec? Oh, no, actually, no, you can leave it. Here's the thing that made me want to write the book first. And this is a perfect Venn diagram of where scientific mind meets batshit. PCR tests.
Yes.
Okay? Everyone knows about PCR tests because of the pandemic. We all took them, we all use them. PCR, I'd never heard of that word before, that little acronym. I'd never heard of it before. It turns out, when it was invented, this was the great game changer in chemistry. It is used for literally every area now of scientific investigation. Forensic policing uses it to use on fingerprints and so on, and the accuracy they can now identify a criminal through PCR testing has amplified by like 1,000%. That's not quite right, but it's massive. Archaeology uses it for virtually everything. King Richard III's bones were used verifying by PCR and a few other things. It is basically, people say that there are two epochs in our world, pre-PCR and post. That's how important it is. And then in the pandemic, we used it, obviously, to tell us if we had COVID. PCR was invented by a single guy who won the Nobel Prize for it. He's called Kary Mullis. And Kary Mullis, the same year that he invented and had the idea for PCR, is the same year that he claims he was abducted by an English-speaking glowing raccoon into its spaceship, and then, no joke, spent the rest of his life trying to prove that. PCR was like a sideline gig for him. He was obsessed. It's this story, right, where
I'm always really surprised that he doesn't claim that's where he got the idea from. Like, it's just a totally separate event that happened in his life that he completely believes is true.
Yeah.
And then separate to that, he's an amazing scientist.
Yeah, exactly. He should have used that as this mysterious thing. But what's interesting is that everyone told him PCR wouldn't work when he had the idea. And they said, you're wasting your time, you're wasting your money. He spent 3 years trying to work out PCR, and he just kept going and it kept going. The same persistence that meant he wanted to find a glowing raccoon is the same thing that didn't stop him from doing that. And I find that a really fascinating territory, because that little in-between is where interesting brains become obsessed over ideas. And so the question is harboring a little bit of batshit important in our lives, or should we be stamping it out? That was the one thing I wanted to look into. In effect, what have ghosts, UFOs, telepathy, and all that stuff actually done for us? And through writing the books, it turns out they've done a lot.
Yeah, I've collected a few of my favourite facts from your book.
Yeah.
And ghosts is, the next one I've got is on ghosts. So the reason Ringo Starr is such a great drummer is thanks to the multiple exorcisms he had as a child. Can you explain that?
Okay. This was this was a one sentence that I read in the biggest book that you can get on the Beatles by the ultimate authority on it. It's 1,000 pages long, this book on the Beatles, and it finishes as they record their first single. So this is the density of this book, right? We're still waiting for volume 2. It's just their childhoods and so on. And there's this one line that suddenly says that when Ringo Starr was a kid, he was left-handed, and his grandmother, who was known as the Voodoo Queen of Liverpool, thought that meant that the devil was inside him, and so she performed multiple exorcisms on him, and she made him become a right-handed person. So he still, to this day, Ringo Starr, writes with his right hand. But, so here's the interesting thing. If you hear any drummers talk about Ringo Starr, there's that big joke that John Lennon said he's not even the best drummer in the Beatles. Completely incorrect. He's one of the most respected drummers out there. And if you look at lists of drummers saying who the best drummers are, he's often in the top 10. He had a style that was loose and different. It was like he was just missing the on-beat by like a microsection, but it was just so consistent. So like the Foo Fighters, if they're recording, Dave Grohl would yell, "Be more Ringo." That's the line that you say. Be more Ringo, loosen up and get us more of a rhythm going here. So what this means is that must have happened for a reason, and it was the exorcisms. So when he started learning the drums, his grandmother had done all these exorcisms on him, and he was a right-handed drummer when he started drumming. So he got a right-handed kit. There are right-handed and left-handed kits in drumming. So if you're a right-handed drummer, you're on this side, and then you go that way, right?
Yeah.
If you're left-handed, you go that way. So he started on a right-handed kit, moved out of home from his grandmother's house, and then slowly became left-handed again. But he remained on a right-handed kit. So when Ringo Starr drums, instead of leading with this hand, he brings this hand under his left hand and leads that way. And that little extra bit of time that it takes for him to do that, makes him a looser drummer. And it's all because of these exorcisms. So it's...
Do you know what form the exorcisms took? Like what?
Beatings and tea.
Okay.
Yeah, right. I would say. Yeah. He loved her. And, I'm sure there's a lot of people who know someone in their life of an older generation who was, in school had left-handedness beat out of them as well.
Yeah.
But in this case, it was, the exorcisms.
That's wild. So there's this whole kind of thread of how these people have changed the world, and it often came from, like, there's a small detail that comes from this kind of weird supernatural belief or superstition or conspiracy belief or something.
Yeah.
How about this one, which feels a little bit more, less so than that, but it's more from like kind of traditional medicine. The Nobel Prize winning scientist who cured malaria discovered the cure in a 1,600-year-old traditional Chinese medicine book called Emergency Remedies to Keep Up Your Sleeve.
Yeah. So malaria was cured by a Chinese scientist, the latest cure, by the way, because I know there's been multiples, but she won the Nobel Prize for this. She's called Tu Youyou. She's a Chinese herbalist in Mao's China, communist China, and she was tasked with finding a cure for malaria. And while the rest of the world was looking for it, she looked to the ancient books. So I think it's quite possibly the only scientific Nobel Prize that has gone to someone who used what is known, I guess, as a fringe or pseudoscience to find the answer of what to do. She's got a really interesting name, by the way. Tu Youyou is taken from the yo-yo in her name, so she's from China. There's a great book of poems that were written back almost 1,600 years ago. And there's a poem where there's a deer that is chewing on a little plant called the qinghao, and it bleats. It goes, yo! And that's in the poem. And the dad saw that and went, that's a great name. So she is named after a deer bleat. That is her actual name.
Right.
Tu-yo-yo. He was like, a beautiful name. So she's got such an iconically interesting name for a Nobel Prize winner as well. She decided, what if the cure was in one of these old books? And so she went back and she looked through it all and she identified something that sounded exactly like it. And again, a beautiful Venn diagram. She was also interested in Western science. So she applied the way that you could extract chemicals from what she read in this book. She used modern science and the old science, and she found that she could extract it.
It's a real combination of like scientific, like having faith in the scientific system, but also just believing and going down a road of like tradition and kind of like cultural trust as well.
Exactly.
And combining the two.
The most exciting thing for me in this story is that there's this sense that Tu-yo-yo has of she can't work out if she was here to do this. As in, was she placed on our planet to find the cure for malaria? And the reason she thinks this is because she went and, there were hundreds of thousands of plants that you can get and try and test to see if it's going to work for malaria. She found the Qinghao plant, right? Which is this is one very specific plant. So what's crazy about this, the Qinghao plant, by unbelievable coincidence, that is the exact same plant that the deer in the poem that her father named her after is chewing. Yes, what indeed. She can't believe that, right? How is that? So she said, that's impossible. And then what's crazy is Western science took it over and it gave it a Greek name, Artemis. It's got a longer name, but it's named after the Greek god Artemis. Who is Artemis always with? It's a deer. It's a deer. That's a total second coincidence to this. So she's gone, well, fuck me. Okay, I was meant to do this. And I love those moments because whether you're skeptical about whether it's destiny or anything like that, when a great story like that comes up, it gives you goosebumps for 2 seconds. It just makes you think differently. There's one that I really love, which is when Ronald Reagan had an assassination attempt on him.
Oh, this is wild.
Yeah,
okay,
this is really interesting. Oh, well, it's really fun. Ronald Reagan was coming out of a hotel in Washington, D.C. Yes, I did accidentally just say it's really fun. He comes out of a hotel in Washington, D.C., and there's a man waiting for him and takes a couple of shots at Reagan. It's a very famous moment. His Secret Service men jump into action, particularly one, a guy called Jerry Parr. Jerry Parr grabs Ronald Reagan, and he throws him into the back of a limousine. They close the door, and they speed off. They're checking Reagan for bullet holes, and there's nothing. They can't feel anything. Reagan's feeling bruised because he's in his 70s, and he's been thrown into a limo, so he's hurting anyway. So they're going back to the White House. As they're going back, Parr notices a bit of blood dribbling out of his mouth, and he goes, "No, you've been shot. I don't know where. Change the course of the limo. We're going to this hotel, the hospital." That's against all protocol for a Secret Service. You don't do that. But he was like, "Go now," and they listened. So they get him to the hospital. Doctors say that if he arrived 5-10 minutes later, he would have been dead, no question. It was just perfect timing. So he's in recovery, and Jerry Parr is hailed as a hero. He's given medals. He's the nation's hero. He goes to visit Ronald Reagan, and Reagan says, "You saved my life." And he says, "Well, actually, I don't know, because here's the thing." And he tells him a story, which is when he was a kid, Jerry Parr, the reason he became a Secret Service agent is his dad took him to a cinema to see a movie called Code of the Secret Service. And there was a lead character in it who was the guy to the president, the Secret Service member, and he loved him. And he watched it like 5 times, and he was like, "That's what I want to do with my life." And so he does, and he eventually manages it, and he becomes it. The actor who played the role of the leading Secret Service guy in that movie that inspired him was Ronald Reagan. So, in a way, Ronald Reagan saved himself because he planted in the mind of a kid the idea, and then he ended...
It's a way more convoluted Back to the Future with like one famous actor in, but...
But it's just great. Those stories are great. Like, Ronald Reagan saved himself.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
How about this one? Okay. According to the famous anthropologist Louis Leakey, the reason Homo sapiens became the dominant species on Earth is because we were too smelly to eat.
Isn't that a wonderful theory? Not to do with the fact that we mastered fire, that we had instruments. He thought that animals, literally, because he was in a tent out in, I can't remember, he was out somewhere in Africa, and a lion came into his tent, sniffed him, and went, "Nah," and walked back out. And he was like, what was that about? And then he started looking into the records and found that it was only after a lion had killed a human in desperation that it would eat it, but only after it had let it rot for like 5 days and maggots had come in and so on. Then we were acceptable as a eating proposition.
I love that, like, that was his. Like, a lion comes in, smells him, and decides not to eat him, and he's like, "Oh no, it can't be that I need a shower. It's that, like, we have evolved as a species to just not be nice. Like, all of us smell like this."
Exactly. I mean, he is, and he's one of the. No one has discovered more hominid skulls and put more into the fossil record than this one guy. And his wife as well, Mary Leakey, who is an incredible anthropologist as well. She made one of the biggest finds of an old bone off the back of her and her friends playing throw the elephant shit at each other. So someone threw it at her, it missed, and she looked down to where it landed, and right next to it was a fossil, and she was like, what's that? And it's one of the oldest we've ever had.
I bet at the press conference, though, she was like, this has been months of hard work in the making. Like, we really have been.
All the rumors of playing throw the elephant shit are absolutely untrue.
Please keep funding us.
Yeah. Well, funding is an interesting one. That you wrote that down as one of your favorite ones,
I did,
right?
actually. Which one was it?
The
NASA funding. Yeah. So NASA once helped fund a scientific project that aimed to teach dolphins to speak English so perfectly that they would be given a chair at the United Nations to speak on behalf of all marine mammals.
And this is we're not making this up, right? This is
the 60s?
This is the 60s. I looked into this.
Of course it was. Yeah.
This was a guy called John C. Lilly. Do you guys remember that there's this whole story about dolphins that were taken into a house? And it ended a bit badly because, the whole project went really badly in the end. But John Lilly at the time was seen by NASA as someone who was on the bridge of being able to have human and animal communication. Dolphins seemed like they were our closest chance, and he felt like he had managed to work out a vocabulary. So he said, let me build a house, and we'll flood half the house, and the dolphins with the humans living there can have dinner in the same room. So they would. You see photos, there were chairs and tables where it's up to the legs with water, and dolphins are swimming through the table as they're eating. He designed a car so that dolphins could drive between the houses, so it was a flooded car, but still had like a steering wheel and stuff, and the dolphins would drive between
It sounds
houses.
Like a Hanna-Barbera cartoon.
Yeah,
like,
right? And he was, John Lilly ended up being associated with people like Timothy Leary, and the big LSD movement was all part of John Lilly. John Lilly, if anyone here has ever gone into a tank, a flotation tank, he invented that as well. He was a big mind, but he was convinced that you could do this thing with dolphins. And when SETI was first set up, so Carl Sagan, Frank Drake, all the top scientists that were looking into communication from space, John Lilly was the first speaker at their first ever get-together. So they had this really weird clandestine meeting where no one told them, they didn't tell anyone where they were going because they didn't want anyone to think they were bad scientists for taking the idea of alien messages seriously and looking for them. So Sagan, Frank Drake, and John Lilly. And the very first ever lecture that was given about at the alien thing was John Lilly talking about how he had trained a dolphin to play catch using a frisbee, but one that's got a hole all the way, like a hoop, right?
Yeah.
He would throw it into the tank, and the idea was the dolphin would achieve an erection and catch the hoop in its erection.
This is where it all started going wrong in that house, I think.
It's very questionable science, yeah. But it's fascinating that is the foundations of SETI, that it was a dolphin man.
Yeah. I also just, I question the logic of, we'll get dolphins on the UN, they'll speak on behalf of all marine mammals.
Yes.
Like, that seems quite, marine mammal racist to be like, dolphins can speak on behalf of all of these. The whales have the same opinions. Why aren't they going to teach the whales as well?
Mm.
Exactly. I think the thing with NASA as well is, we look back and we think of NASA as being this, it's sort of the apex of scientific work, and they're always going to be really serious. But there were so many They funded and were so interested in all of these fringe things as well. All the stuff that happened on the moon, especially during the Apollo era.
Oh my God.
All of the weird experiments and...
Every moon landing astronaut, basically, except maybe two, were batshit as fuck. They were... I cannot believe we sent them to the moon. It's insane. There was one guy who was doing telepathic experiments on the way to the moon. That was in between. That was his downtime. He had two people back on Earth who were meant to be reading all of the symbols that he was trying to send through his brain back to Earth.
It was literally like the thing in Ghostbusters, right? Where like
Yes.
he's like looking at symbols on a piece of paper, and then someone's trying to guess back on Earth what he's thinking of and stuff.
Yeah. There's one. What was the name of the astronaut who was on the final mission?
Was Harrison Schmidt?
No, not
Because
Schmidt.
he's the one who's allergic to the moon. He got to the moon and started sneezing in the capsule, which is so unfortunate.
They accidentally sent a man with an allergy to the moon. It's wild.
Unfortunately, he was
Harrison
the
Schmidt.
last person to ever go to the moon. I really hope it's not that reason.
Yeah. They sent an astronaut who was secretly a creationist who had a reason for going up to the moon, which is they wanted to find the Genesis stone, which was going to prove that the world was built in 7 days, right? So there was a moment up on the moon where a piece of kit broke, and it was a really essential bit of kit. And he should have called NASA and said, "What do I do?" But instead, he asked God what he should do, and God told him, and so he did it, and it was right. But that is wild that we had someone up there who wasn't talking to the engineers, was talking to the.
But it also they weren't also like diametrically opposed. There was loads of when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin stepped out on the moon. One of the first things that they did, Buzz Aldrin, I think it was because we met him. Remember, he did communion. They sent up. Well, because he came on your radio show and we got to talk to him about it. But so they did all these different things. They had they were making all sorts of speeches. They were taking up works of art and things. But they also in the plan was to do communion. So they sent up like a wafer and wine for Buzz Aldrin to have, but they packed white wine instead of red wine, so he had to do it with white, which I also think is such a testament of like everything they had to do to get to the moon, that unbelievable achievement, and it's still like that small bit of admin that you kind of screw up.
Yeah, exactly. And I knew that about Buzz Aldrin because that's quite famous.
Yeah.
And I thought, okay, but surely Neil Armstrong was, I thought he was actually just an atheist. He was all about the science. And it turns out not. It turns out that his first step on the moon wasn't even his favorite footstep that he ever took. And it was when he went to a temple that there were stones leading up to it where Jesus might have walked on. And when he was told that Jesus might have walked on, he said, "I'm more excited about stepping on these stones than I was standing on the moon." That's wild.
Yeah, but that's one of those big actors or musicians who's like got a massive film or like album that everyone was talking about. They're like, no, I'd actually rather talk about my more recent work.
Yeah.
This local project I did.
I've had other footsteps.
Stepped in a lot of other places, and they've been much better. Yeah.
Yeah, the difficult second footstep. That should be what we talk about with him. But yeah, all of those NASA guys are amazing. But there are amazing stories. And what I loved in writing the book, and again, it's sort of interesting when you look at the history of NASA, how much of it, again, is guided by these weird little moments. And there's the famous story of Apollo 13, where it was launched at 13:13 Florida time. It was the astronaut who was replaced at last minute was the 13th astronaut on the Apollo missions in their entirety. It launched on April the 11th, but the explosion happened on April the 13th. And so there was all these things about 13 being...
It's amazing that like they got as far as they did and they made it back. Like, it's amazing they got off a launch pad.
Also that's just the greatest return story ever. A broken tin can in space hurtling away from the planet. How do you get it back? It's an incredible thing. And there's a story that no one really has... I'm obsessed with Apollo 13. I've met Jim Lovell, the captain of it, and I'd never heard this thing that I found for the book, which is that on the day that it exploded, they had a really short window of working out how to save the water and the battery. And they needed to do something really quick. Otherwise, it was going to go dead and they would know not what to do, right? So they called up, after it happened, one of the engineers who had worked on that area of the mission. And they said, "We don't know what to do." And he said, "This is so weird. I know exactly what to do." And the only reason he knew what to do is the night before that it happened, so he was woken up at like 3 a.m. At like 7 p.m. that previous evening, he went to the movies to see a film that was out at the time about a spaceship in space having an explosion and them needing to work out how to save the water and the battery in order to survive. So he got in the car after the movie and went, "God, I wonder what I would do if I was asked the question, how are you going to..." And he spent the entire evening thinking about it, fell asleep in bed, his phone rings, "What's up? I know exactly what to do." And it's thanks to him and that weird coincidence of timing.
It wasn't a pre-release of Ron Howard's Apollo 13 that you saw. It was just a really...
That's the great thing when Apollo 13 was shown to test audiences, and at the ending when they come in, one of the messages that came through was, "Nah, it's not a believable ending. That's so Hollywood." They wouldn't have made it back.
Also, you just reminded me saying when you met Jim Lovell, we met Jim Lovell together because we went to a kind of like space sort of like lecture conference thing, and I thought it was going to be like massive, like a huge kind of Comic-Con for scientists, but actually it was quite a small thing. It was in a school.
It was in Pontefract.
Yeah, in Pontefract. Yeah, it was really great. But before the actual lecture where he did this amazing talk, there's like a photo shoot opportunity where you can go and get your photo taken. It's like a bit like this. This is like a green screen, and you sort of shake hands with him, and then they superimpose a picture of the rocket behind, and you sort of paid a bit of money. And there was a queue at the beginning, and we waited for a while. Then the queue really died down after we'd done ours, and so we went through like 3 more times.
It was like we were riding him like a roller coaster. We just like popped back in the queue. He was like, "You guys again." We were doing double photos.
He didn't recognize us every time. He's just like, "Yeah, nice to meet you." Yeah.
Yeah, no, that was really great.
It was really fun. Can we switch to time travel? This is one of my favorite facts I think you've ever told me. Or facts. There is a theory that the reason the Titanic sank is not because it hit an iceberg, but because so many time travelers visited it at the same time that their combined weight forced it underwater.
Yeah. And it really makes sense if you think about it, guys. We've all had that, where would you go if we crack time travel? And inevitably we're going, the Titanic, we're going to go see the Titanic. So imagine all of history going back to the Titanic after the event. Of course, I worked out for the book how many people it would take in a pile to do. And it was something like 45,000 people who were at the height of Leonardo DiCaprio. If you had that height, yeah.
Oh, do you mean the height of his fame,
yes.
or like just his actual height?
Yeah. Which was that
a lot
movie.
of A-listers.
Yeah, no, I love facts.
I've never thought of this before, but surely when we dive down to see the Titanic, there would just be a massive pile of skeletons on top of it.
Well, that's the government covering up all of the...
Oh, sure, okay, fine, yeah.
No, I mean, and there's a lot of holes in the theory. There's
and the boat.
Yeah, because if they're going back to see the Titanic hitting an iceberg, surely that needs to happen in order to...
But nobody reported back once because they all died, and then, like, if somebody thought that they'd hit the iceberg, or maybe they hit the iceberg, or the travellers arrived a bit late...
It's food for thought, right? Like, it's a very...
What was the theory, the hypothetical way to get the Titanic back up? They were trying to
Oh, that was amazing, yeah. So there's been so many theories. How do we get the Titanic back up? Obviously, right after they wanted to do that, there was an idea that if you filled it up with ping pong balls, the airs in the ball would lift it back up to the surface. Weirdly, with a smaller ship, the Mythbuster team tested that, and it worked. They actually managed to bring it back up with ping pong balls. The greatest idea was someone said that they should put a wired mesh around the Titanic and turn the Titanic itself into an iceberg, and then it would raise back up to the surface.
Cool, yeah. And kind of horribly ironic.
That's an incredible idea. There's a whole thing with Titanic where there's been a lot of, I'm sure a few of you will have heard of this, of books where there was a premonition about the Titanic sinking, where it was a ship called Titan or Titanic, and it did sink, and these were all written prior to the Titanic sinking. And there used to be this amazing journalist called W.T. Stead. Steed. He was very big in the UK as a journalist, kind of like the original Michael Moore. He did investigative journalism that actually led to Parliament changing acts as a result of it. But he also believed in the paranormal. He set up a bureau, an agency on the Strand in London where you could get in contact with a loved one who'd passed away. And the company was run by a lady called Julia. And what no one knew at the time was Julia had died 40 years previous or something like that. And that W.T. Stead had met her in a seance and set up a business with her, which she was now running from the other side.
How does that even work, like, tax-wise? Like, how do you even file that?
Interestingly, there's a box for that on the tax forms. But so W.T. Stead had all these weirdnesses in his life, and one of the things that he's not as well known for is he also wrote a story that predicted the Titanic sinking, if you were to believe it, as in the detail was so close. And the one thing that he said in his story, and it was about a boat going across the same route, it had as its lead character the actual captain of the Titanic, who became the captain of the Titanic, so it was very close. And he says at the end, as an editorial note, God, imagine if you don't have enough lifeboats on the boat, that this could lead to a total disaster, because that's part of the story. So, unfortunately, W.T. Stead never got to experience his psychic ability with this story, which he would have loved, absolutely loved, if he thought he had a premonition about it. Never got to experience it because he died on the Titanic.
That is like your final moments where you just be like, how have I done this? That's just awful.
Yeah.
This is a completely random fact that I learned the other day about the Titanic, is that we're not sure exactly what time the Titanic thing. We think we know exactly what time it sank because we mainly from the messages, but the reason that that no one knew exactly what time it was on board is because when you travel, obviously, around the world from England to New York, there's like a 5-hour time difference. The way they did it when it was like a multi-day voyage is they would change the clocks by like a number of minutes, like at midnight. So you would experience, like, you'd only go forward. You wouldn't go forward by the hour, basically, every day. Or like you would move by the minutes. And the sinking was just after midnight, so no one knows whether they'd moved the clock forward like 17 minutes or whatever, which is.
And
weird.
also, when you read into it, so many things went wrong on the day in terms of where the positioning of the moon was, there's a theory that there was a supermoon that had come close to Earth 3 months previous, that had set off a couple of icebergs that were up near Greenland.
Oh, yeah.
That floated all the way down, and they were the icebergs that would have sunk the Titanic.
Yeah, because they chased it all the way back.
Yeah, because they shouldn't have been there. So the sun, the moon, the ocean, the foggy atmosphere, it's basically universally... The universe wanted to fuck the Titanic, if you look at it.
It was a phenomenally unlikely set of circumstances. Everyone looks back and they're like, everyone was so responsible, but actually it was really unlucky.
It's like an Agatha Christie where it turns out at the ending everyone murdered the person. It's like one of those ones. Yeah.
Should we finish on the soft rock?
Yeah, okay. Well, I would say just an interesting point, because I think this is a territory where people find it a bit, it's a bit odd. It's sort of looking into the odd stuff. But I do genuinely think that thinking a bit differently can help you. And if you take in the idea that you shouldn't necessarily believe all this stuff, there was a great theater guy called Ken Campbell, who I absolutely love, and he said this thing, which is, don't believe in things, suppose in them. I suppose ghosts could exist. I suppose aliens could exist. I suppose you could suppose all these things, and it allows you to get an insight into the world that you might have shut off. And I think it is interesting. I have a thing which I call the rough corner, and the rough corner is a Zen gardener's principle, which is, in a garden that is immaculately kept by a Zen gardener, they will always leave one tiny bit of the garden completely untouched, completely left alone, and let it grow wild and how it is, so that the gardener can be reminded of how the universe intended for it to look. It's a humbling thing to show that in chaos there can be beauty as well. And I do think that, we do need to keep that little rough corner of the brain alive, where we allow for these stories that we know probably don't sit with our own belief systems, like the Titanic, W.T. Stead or whatever, but give yourself 2 seconds for it to give you goosebumps, and then return to whatever. It's like a magic eye. Just see that world for 2 seconds and then blink and you're back to your own. But I think in those 2 seconds, those stories can do a lot to you, and they have changed the world in ways that we haven't realized. We were talking backstage with a previous guest, Tim, about the invention of the EEG machine, this is a machine that is used in medical science every day. Right now it's used to read the brain, and it's so, so important, and it's changed the world of medicine. It was invented by a guy called Hans Berger back in the late 1800s, I think it was. He was a military teenager. He'd snuck into the military illegally for his age, and he was out walking one day, and he didn't notice that there was a whole cavalry of horses heading towards him, and they almost ran him over. And at the point where he thought he was going to die, he said in his head, "I'm dead." It didn't happen, and he looked up, and the horses had somehow stopped. And so he thought, oh my God, that's super lucky. He gets home, and later that afternoon, a telegram comes through, and it's from his dad saying, "Sorry to send you this message, but your sister just had the craziest feeling today that you were going to die." Like around the afternoon, she was just, "We need to check that you're okay." And he thought, my God, was that a telepathic moment? Did I do that? So he spent the next 30 years trying to invent a telepathy machine, and accidentally invented the EEG machine along the way, which we now use and has saved millions of lives around the world.
Incredible. So, it's kind of that cliche of like, it's not about it's the opposite. It's not about the journey, it's the destination. It doesn't really matter how you get to these things, because people have taken these weird roundabout journeys that aren't scientifically explainable. But
exactly.
They've still invented these life-changing things, discovered these incredible world-changing things. Yeah.
But I'll leave you on one story, which is a thing I called the soft rock, which is really important. These stories are great and they're amazing, thing, and I genuinely, I'm really excited that I've written a book for kids about this stuff, because I do think it can ignite them. It does remind them to always be skeptical about stuff, and don't just believe it, look into it. But there's a thing that my friend experienced at a festival once called Boom. I don't know if anyone's been to that festival, but he went out, did a lot of drugs, and he came back the next morning. His friends were like, "Where were you? We were so worried." And he said, "Man, it was incredible, an incredible night. I got lost in a field, so I thought I'd sleep here, and I laid down on a rock as a pillow, and it was a soft rock." And they were like, "What?" And he was like, "It was a soft rock, I swear to God. It was a bendy rock. It cushioned my head." And so they spent the whole day talking about this soft rock, and he was like, "It's real." And they were like, "No, it's not real. This is not real." So here's the thing. My friend could have spent the rest of his life thinking that he'd found a soft rock. He'd be talking about it today in pubs. "Man, I slept on a soft rock." But fortunately, my other friends had the foresight to say, "Show me this fucking rock then, okay? Like, you didn't sleep on a soft rock." So he took them on a 2-hour walk into this field. He found the tree where it was, and he saw it, and he pointed to it. And my friends were blown away, because there it was. But they weren't blown away because it was a soft rock. They were just blown away because they couldn't believe my friend was so dumb that he used a cow pat as a pillow for the evening. And what had happened is that it had baked in the Portugal sun, so there was like a hard shell over it. And when he laid his head, it cushioned it in and didn't break. And he later said to me, he was like, "I should have known when there were flies all around me in the morning that would have been a giveaway." But that's the important thing. Is the thing real? Go check it out, double check, because it might turn out that your soft rock is just a pile of bullshit. So that's the message we'll leave you on. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
That was really fun.